Welcome back to Fast Market, everyone. Kevin Hinks and Nathan Peterson back for our second segment of the show. I'd now like to bring in Miss Megan Brantley. She's the Vice President of Research at LikeFolio.com. Megan, you've got some heavy lifting today. I've seen you've brought a lot of data to today's show, and why wouldn't you on a company like Apple? Megan, what is the LikeFolio data seeing in terms of Apple.com and their earnings today?
So, as we head into earnings, we know that there is some anticipated slowdown in the growth figure that they're expected to report. And our data does confirm this. When we look at comprehensive demand across all of the different products and services under Apple's umbrella, we see that down by about 9% year over year. For us, this is, a slowdown in momentum. I think that this slowdown is to be expected. And we can kind of segment this into two different categories. We can look at devices and we can look at services. So first, we'll key in on these devices. And I think what's really interesting is that you see some strength in terms of, demand growth, and what's really being that strong point for Apple is its iPhone, which is really important and really significant in your Apple. If you're Apple, you love to see this because, they've got a big lineup anticipated this year, and we do see demand building around this iPhone device. I think it's also interesting that whenever you look at the iPhone compared to these other devices, I think of this and I think of the iPhone almost as like an essential. Your phone, this device that you have that does everything, that connects you to all of these services. This is like an essential item. And so to see this healthy demand here, I think isn't surprising. Some of these others, the Apple Watch, iPads, one thing that's not on here, AirPods, it should be. We also see a decline year over year in this. These are almost these kind of want to haves. Supplementary, of course, but want to haves. And so we do see some weakness in these other devices. There's a little bit of a split there, but I think that all of these devices are really just like a gateway drug into Apple's services segment, which has been a really strong point previously for Apple. Whenever we look at this services revenue growth, we do see a slight slowdown in the mentions of people who are talking about utilizing these Apple services. But, this may not be as much of a slowdown as people expect. So for us, heading into earnings, it's interesting because, we do see strength in that Apple iPhone demand, which could be a bright spot and an unexpected bright spot in its report. But we see some weaknesses in other devices and in the services overall that could, counteract this.
Hey, Megan, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining. In regards to that services, we've seen some talk about Apple over the years not being too innovative, and therefore, perhaps some of those upgrades don't happen as frequently. And so they ventured out into wearables. They've gone into service. They've been able to tap into some more growth there. And I think from the street's perspective, I think what a lot of people are looking forward to is potentially that hardware subscription. They want that reoccurring revenue. Do you have anything in your data that's talked to basically consumers' willingness or interest in getting into some kind of a hardware subscription service?
That's a really good question. I didn't look into, hardware subscription services, but one thing that we did look into are these Apple iPhone, upgrades. I think that could be something that's really indicative of consumers willing to, participate in some type of an upgrade cycle. And we see that those mentions are up by about 13% year over year. So especially heading into, next quarter, which is really the big quarter for Apple when it comes to, devices, we see some really healthy demand there and a lot of indications from consumers that they're ready to upgrade, that this is, I think, going to be a really strong upgrade cycle for Apple in 2022.
Megan, when I look at your data and I see the differences between the what's happening with the iPhone, which is still remaining strong, and what's happening with services. My question on your data, Megan, is this. It looks like more and more people seem to be going into the Apple ecosystem and away from Samsung and their phones. Am I reading your data right? Is that what you're seeing here in terms of people going into the Apple ecosystem? Once you go in, Megan, you don't ever come out, right? So once you go in their ecosystem, they've got you with everything, with the phone, with the EarPods, with everything. Is that what your data is showing, that more and more people are switching from Samsungs or their other phones into Apple?
Yeah, whenever we look really long term at how the consumer, that loyalty is building for Apple, we've got two different views here. These are mentions of consumers who are talking about switching to an Android device, and you can see those waning year over year. Those peaks a lot of times have to do with the Apple keynote event. So you can see in 2017, I think Apple had kind of a rough launch, and you see that huge peak of people who are talking about, oh, maybe I'll try this Android device. But since then, there's been significant year-over-year decline. On the flip side, whenever we look at consumers who are talking about, switching into this Apple ecosystem, like you mentioned, adopting an iPhone, those mentions are actually up 93% versus where they were 3 years ago. You can see that significant increase and really acceleration even over the last year. So I think that this is a really positive sign because, as Apple gets more, as consumers get these devices, they then dive into these services. I think that Apple has 825 million paid subscriptions. That's insane. I think that I probably account for a handful of those. I know I have multiple Apple paid subscriptions that I see come through just as a single user. And it's become one of those things where Apple is really, sinking its teeth in just to the daily life. I have my iCloud subscription that I have, and a lot of consumers talk about that, you want your storage and you're not willing to give it up. It's become this essential item versus just this like to have item. I think that really speaks to the stickiness of Apple. So heading into this report, our data, we do see that softening overall across the board in Apple demand. And so our score actually comes out to about a -6. So we're pretty neutral, but we do see some signs of light in this current quarter that we're in. We're about a month in, whereas we saw, I mentioned that demand was slipping by about 9% year over year. Now we have that demand kicking back up just in the last month, up about 3% year over year. So I think that could be a bright spot for Apple's guidance, that they're starting to see, demand pick back up for these devices specifically, especially ahead of the highly anticipated keynote event. But for this earnings event, we don't really have an edge and we're pretty neutral.
Megan Brantley, we always appreciate you coming on the show and giving us the LikeFolio view of the world as you see it. You've given us a lot of information here on Apple, and even though there is some weakness, you're still painting a pretty bright picture as the world continues either at a slow pace or a fast pace to move into the Apple ecosystem. Megan, thank you so much for coming on the show. Have a great day. That is Megan Brantley, the Vice President of Research at LikeFolio.com. Nathan,